The drive home was quiet, the events of the night weighing heavily on Maya and Malik. The city streets were eerily empty, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and the hum of the car engine seemed louder than it should have. Maya stared out the window, her mind spinning with unanswered questions, and the unsettling realization of how little control she had over something she had once thought of as her own. "What do you think they were trying to do?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but Malik could hear the strain behind it. "I don't know," Malik admitted, his hands gripping the wheel. "But it's clear this wasn't random. That guy said it himself. Your car was special. They chose it for a reason." Maya frowned, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the fabric of her jeans. "But why me? I don't have anything to do with whatever that was." Malik glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it wasn't about you. Maybe it was just about the car itself. The tech, the systems. It's advanced in ways most people don't even think about. They could have been testing something, using it as a proof of concept." The idea didn't bring Maya much comfort. She thought about all the times she had driven the car, trusting it to get her safely from one place to another, never considering that it could be manipulated or used against her. It felt like a betrayal, even though she knew the car wasn't alive. She sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. "I'm not sure I can trust it anymore," she said quietly. Malik nodded. "I get it, but it's not the car's fault. It's the people behind this, whoever they are. They're the ones who did this, not you." Maya appreciated his attempt to reassure her, but the unease lingered. Even as they pulled into her driveway and Malik shut off the engine, the night didn't feel like it was over. She hesitated before getting out of the car, her hand hovering over the door handle. "You don't have to stay here alone," Malik said, sensing her hesitation. "I can stay over, just in case." Maya managed a small smile. "Thanks, but I think I'll be okay. I just need some time to process everything." He didn't press her, nodding as he stepped out of the car and walked her to the door. "Call me if you need anything, okay? And don't let this scare you off from driving. You've got every right to feel safe in your own car." Maya nodded, his words echoing in her mind as she watched him drive away. Inside the house, she locked the door behind her, double-checking it out of habit before heading to her bedroom. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she picked it up, half expecting another cryptic message. Instead, it was a notification from the car's app. "Factory settings restored. All data wiped." She stared at the screen, the weight of those words sinking in. Everything the car had been through tonight, the strange messages, the commands, the overrides, was supposedly gone. But was it really? Could she trust that whoever had been behind it wouldn't find a way back in? She set the phone down, her thoughts spinning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, and for a brief moment, Maya felt a sense of normalcy return. She got up, made coffee, and tried to distract herself with a book, but the events of the previous night lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't until a knock at the door startled her that she realized she'd been on edge the entire time. Opening the door, she found one of the officers from the night before, the tall one who had been part of the chase. He looked more relaxed now, his demeanor professional, but not as tense as it had been. "Ms. Jackson," he said, nodding politely. "I wanted to stop by and give you an update." Maya invited him in, her curiosity piqued. The officer declined a seat, standing by the door as he spoke. "We've done some digging into the man we arrested last night. Turns out he's part of a larger group, one that's been experimenting with advanced vehicle tech for questionable purposes." Maya folded her arms, her unease growing. "What kind of purposes?" The officer hesitated before answering. "We're still piecing it together, but it looks like they've been using cars like yours to test remote control systems. They claim it's for research, but there are clear security risks involved. Your car was targeted because its systems are particularly advanced and, let's say, compatible with their methods. Will they be able to do it again?" Maya asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "We don't think so," the officer said. "The modifications they made have been wiped clean. But I'd recommend having a professional inspect the car just to be safe. And if you notice anything unusual, report it immediately." Maya nodded, feeling a small sense of relief but still wary. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." The officer nodded again, tipping his hat before leaving. Maya closed the door behind him, leaning against it as she processed what he'd said. The people behind this might have been stopped, but the idea that her car had been used as part of some larger scheme still left her unsettled. Later that day, she took the car to a trusted mechanic, who assured her it was safe to drive. Still, as she got behind the wheel, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She wasn't just driving a car anymore. She was driving a reminder of how vulnerable even the most advanced systems could be. As she pulled out of the driveway, the car hummed to life, its smooth engine a familiar sound. The road stretched ahead, and for the first time in hours, Maya felt a small sense of control return. She didn't know what the future held or if she'd ever fully trust the car again, but she did know one thing. She wouldn't let fear dictate her life. Whatever had happened that night, it had taught her a valuable lesson about resilience and vigilance. Technology might be powerful, but so was she. And as the sun set on another day, Maya decided that she would move forward, 1 mile at a time. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing against the walls of the narrow street. The boys turned toward the source, their hearts pounding in their chests. Out of the shadows emerged an older man, his face lined with years of wisdom and worry. He carried a flashlight that cut through the lingering darkness, its beam landing on the officer still kneeling on the ground. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. His eyes moved quickly, taking in the scene. The trembling officer, the frightened boys, and the uneasy stillness that hung in the air. Neither the boys nor the officer answered immediately. The younger boy finally found his voice, though it was small and uncertain. He stopped us, said we were doing something wrong." The older man's gaze hardened as he turned his attention to the officer. "Is that true?" The officer, still visibly shaken, struggled to respond. His lips moved, but no coherent words came out. It was as if whatever had just happened had stolen not only his composure, but also his ability to explain himself. The man's flashlight lingered on the officer for a moment longer before he sighed and turned back to the boys. "Are you hurt?" They shook their heads, though the fear in their eyes spoke volumes. The man nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You two should head home. It's late." The older brother hesitated, glancing at the officer one last time. "What about him?" The man followed his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Don't worry about him. Just go." Reluctantly, the boys picked up their basketball and began walking away, their footsteps quick and quiet. They didn't look back, though their thoughts were filled with questions they couldn't yet put into words. As they disappeared into the distance, the man crouched down in front of the officer, his voice low and steady. "What happened here?" The officer shook his head, his breathing still uneven. I don't know," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was this sound, and then—" He trailed off, his eyes darting around as if searching for something that wasn't there. The man studied him for a long moment before standing up. "You should head back to the station. Get yourself checked out." The officer nodded weakly, his movements slow and unsteady as he climbed to his feet. Without another word, he stumbled back to his patrol car and drove off, the red and blue lights fading into the night. The man watched him go, his expression thoughtful. He stood there for a moment longer, the silence pressing in around him. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. Meanwhile, the boys had made it home, their minds still racing. Their grandmother was waiting for them, her face lighting up with relief as they walked through the door. "You're late," she said, her voice a mix of concern and mild reproach. "Sorry," the older boy mumbled, setting the basketball down by the door. The younger one hesitated, glancing at his brother before speaking. "Something happened," he said quietly. Their grandmother's brow furrowed as she sat down at the kitchen table, motioning for them to join her. "What do you mean?" The boys exchanged a look, unsure of how to explain. Finally, the older one spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush. "This cop stopped us. He said we were doing something wrong, but we weren't. And then there was this sound and lights. And he just fell apart." Their grandmother listened intently, her hands folded on the table. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "You're safe now," she said softly. "That's all that matters." But her eyes betrayed her worry. She didn't press them for more details, but it was clear that their story had unsettled her. That night, the boys lay awake in their shared room, the events of the evening replaying in their minds. The younger one finally broke the silence. "Do you think it was something supernatural?" The older boy turned toward him, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know, but whatever it wasn't normal." They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. Whatever had happened that night, they knew it wasn't over. The next day, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Some people claimed to have heard the strange hum, while others dismissed it as a prank or an overactive imagination. But those who had seen the officer later that night spoke of a man who looked like he had seen a ghost. The boys tried to go about their day as usual, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Everywhere they went, they felt the weight of unseen eyes following them. Even at school, they found it hard to focus, their thoughts constantly drifting back to the strange events of the night before. As the day wore on, they began to notice other odd things. Electronics in their house would flicker or malfunction when they were near. Lights would dim and brighten without explanation. And always, there was that faint hum, just on the edge of hearing, as if the very air around them was alive with some unseen energy. Their grandmother noticed it too, though she didn't say anything at first. But one evening, as they sat down for dinner, she finally spoke. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice calm but serious. The boys looked at her, their expressions wary. "About what?" the older one asked. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "About our family. About where we come from." The room fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. The boys leaned forward, their curiosity piqued despite their lingering fear. "There's a history in our family," she began, her voice steady but low. "A connection to things most people don't understand. It's not something we talk about, because most wouldn't believe it. But I think it's time you knew." She paused, her eyes searching theirs for any sign of understanding. "Whatever happened to you last night, it's part of that connection. And it's something we need to figure out together." The boys exchanged a glance, their minds racing with questions. But before they could ask, the faint hum returned, louder this time, and impossible to ignore. The lights flickered, and a chill swept through the room. Their grandmother stood up, her expression calm but determined. "Stay here," she said firmly. "I'll handle this." But the boys couldn't stay still. They followed her as she walked to the front door, their hearts pounding in their chests. When she opened it, the sight that greeted them made their breath catch. Standing on the porch was the officer from the night before, his face pale and his hands trembling. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a figure cloaked in shadow, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. The officer's voice was barely audible as he spoke, his words trembling with fear. "Please, help me." And just like that, the world they thought they knew shattered, leaving them standing on the edge of something far bigger than they could have ever imagined. The officer stood trembling on the porch, his shadow stretching long in the dim light spilling from the house. His uniform, once crisp and authoritative, now seemed disheveled, his badge barely catching the light as it swayed on his chest. Behind him, the figure in the shadows loomed, its presence suffocating and unexplainable. The boys clung to their grandmother's sides, their breaths shallow and their eyes wide with fear. "Help me," the officer whispered again, his voice cracking under the weight of his terror. Their grandmother didn't move, her expression unreadable as she stared at the man. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with caution. "I don't know," he stammered, his gaze darting to the figure behind him. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't know what's happening." The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The boys couldn't make out any features, only the sense of something ancient and powerful. The air seemed to thicken around it, the faint hum they had been hearing now growing louder, resonating deep in their chests. Their grandmother took a step forward, her shoulders squared as if shielding the boys from whatever this was. "You brought this here," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Whatever you did, you've opened a door you weren't meant to touch." The officer shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't do anything. I was just doing my job." "Your job," she repeated, her tone sharp. "Harassing children in the middle of the night, using your power to intimidate the innocent." The officer's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the porch. "I didn't know," he sobbed. "I didn't know they were different." The boys exchanged a quick glance, their fear momentarily replaced by confusion. Different? What did he mean? The figure in the shadows moved again, its presence growing heavier. The hum turned into a low vibration that made the ground beneath their feet tremble. The younger boy clutched his grandmother's hand, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she kept her eyes on the figure, her face set in grim determination. "It's not human," she said finally, her words sending a chill down their spines. The officer let out a strangled cry, his hands clawing at the porch as if trying to crawl away. "It's here because of me," he choked out. "I shouldn't have touched them. I shouldn't have." His words trailed off, his body convulsing as the figure stepped closer. The boys could feel the air grow colder, their breaths visible in the dim light. Their grandmother turned to them, her voice urgent but steady. "Go inside. Now." The older boy hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in. "We can't leave you out here." "Do as I say," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, they retreated into the house, peeking through the window as their grandmother faced the figure. The officer's cries had subsided into weak whimpers, his body trembling as he lay sprawled on the porch. Their grandmother took a deep breath, her hands steady at her sides. "You don't belong here," she said to the figure, her voice carrying an authority the boys had never heard before. "Leave these children alone." The figure didn't respond, but the hum grew louder, almost deafening now. The lights inside the house flickered wildly, and the boys pressed themselves against the wall, their hearts racing. "What is she doing?" the younger one whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I don't know," his brother replied, his eyes fixed on the scene outside. "But she's not scared." And she wasn't. Despite the overwhelming presence of the figure, their grandmother stood firm, her gaze unwavering. She raised her hand, her fingers moving in a pattern that seemed to draw the air around her into motion. The boys couldn't understand what she was doing, but they felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to her will. The figure hesitated, its movements slowing. The hum began to waver, its steady rhythm faltering. For a moment, it seemed as though their grandmother's strength might be enough to drive it away. But then, the figure surged forward, its form becoming sharper, more defined. The boys could see it now, its shape humanoid but wrong, its edges blurring as if it didn't fully belong in this world. Their grandmother staggered, the force of its presence pressing against her. She gritted her teeth, her hands moving faster as she fought to hold her ground. "You won't take them," she said through clenched teeth. "Not while I'm here." The figure let out a sound that wasn't a voice but a vibration, a low guttural resonance that shook the walls of the house. The boys covered their ears, the noise unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The figure froze, its form flickering like a dying flame. The officer, who had been silent for several moments, let out a gasp and collapsed completely, his body limp. Their grandmother lowered her hands, her breathing heavy but controlled. She turned to the door, her eyes meeting the boys. "Stay where you are," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for disobedience. She stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. The boys rushed to her side, their questions tumbling out in a flurry of words. "What was that? Are you okay? What's happening to us?" She held up a hand, silencing them. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "That thing isn't gone. It's only been pushed back for now." The boys stared at her, their fear and confusion plain on their faces. "What does it want?" the older one asked. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the window where the figure had been moments before. "It's drawn to you," she said finally, "to the energy you carry. It's something that's been in our family for generations, but it's never been this strong before." The younger boy's voice trembled as he spoke. "Why now?" "I don't know," she admitted, her expression troubled. "But whatever it is, we need to find out before it's too late." A sudden crash from outside made them all jump. The boys clung to their grandmother as the sound of shattering glass echoed through the night. The figure was back, and this time it wasn't alone. The hum returned, louder and more menacing than before. The walls of the house seemed to vibrate with its intensity, and the lights flickered wildly. The boys felt the air grow colder, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Their grandmother stood tall, her eyes blazing with determination. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. The boys obeyed, their fear giving way to a deep, unshakable trust in her. Whatever was coming, they knew she would do everything in her power to protect them. But as the hum reached a deafening pitch and the shadows outside grew darker, they couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than they could understand. The house trembled under the weight of the unseen force, the vibrations coursing through the walls like a heartbeat gone mad. The boys clung to their grandmother's sides, their eyes wide with terror as the humming grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed like the very air was screaming. The shadows outside the window thickened, swirling like a storm, and the figure from before reappeared, its form even more solid and menacing than before. But now it wasn't alone. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, each one more grotesque and unnatural than the last. Their grandmother's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Whatever happens, don't move. Do you understand?" The boys nodded, their fear rendering them speechless. The older one tightened his grip on his brother's hand, silently promising to protect him no matter what. The figure outside raised an arm, or what looked like an arm, and the glass in the windows shattered inward, spraying the room with shards. The boys ducked instinctively, their grandmother stepping in front of them, as if her presence alone could shield them from the onslaught. Then, without warning, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, the absence of sound almost more terrifying than the noise itself. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house were holding its breath. And then they heard it, a voice, low and guttural. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You cannot stop us," it said, the words reverberating through the room. "They belong to us." Their grandmother's jaw tightened, her hand steady as she faced the shattered window. "They belong to no one," she said firmly. "Leave this place." The voice let out a sound that might have been laughter, though it was twisted and hollow. "You think your bloodline can protect them. It is your bloodline that brought us here." The boys exchanged a quick, frightened glance. Their grandmother had mentioned the family's connection to strange forces, but this was the first time they'd heard it described as a curse. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," their grandmother said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "This is not your world. You have no power here." The voice didn't respond immediately. Instead, the shadows outside began to shift, taking on new shapes that were both mesmerizing and horrifying. The boys couldn't look away, their fear mingling with a strange, almost magnetic pull. Their grandmother noticed their dazed expressions and clapped her hands sharply. "Look at me," she commanded. "Don't let it draw you in." The sound snapped them out of their trance, and they turned their eyes away from the window, their hearts pounding. But the momentary distraction was all the figure needed. With a sudden, violent surge, it pushed through the broken window, its form spilling into the room like smoke given shape. The boys screamed, their grandmother stepping in front of them once more, her hands raised in a defensive gesture. The figure hesitated, its movements jerky and unnatural. For a moment, it seemed almost uncertain, as if it hadn't expected this level of resistance. But then it lunged, its form stretching toward the boys with a speed that defied logic. Their grandmother reacted instantly, her hands moving in a series of intricate gestures that seemed to pull the very light from the room. A barrier of shimmering energy sprang up between them and the figure, its surface rippling like water. The figure collided with the barrier, letting out a screech that made the boys cover their ears. It recoiled, its form flickering, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. "You will not have them," their grandmother said, her voice filled with a quiet but unyielding power. The figure didn't respond, but the shadows around it began to shift again, coalescing into something even more terrifying. The boys could feel the temperature drop, their breaths coming out in visible puffs of air. And then, just when it seemed like the barrier might hold, the second twist revealed itself. From behind them, a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from the very floor beneath their feet. The boys turned, their eyes widening in horror as they realized the shadows had infiltrated the house itself. The pounding grew louder, more insistent, until the floorboards began to crack and splinter. Their grandmother's expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "This isn't possible," she murmured, her voice barely audible. The older boy's voice trembled as he spoke. "What's happening?" "They're breaking the rules," she said, her tone grim. "They're not supposed to be able to do this." The floor gave way with a deafening crash, and from the darkness below, more figures began to emerge. These were smaller than the one outside, but no less terrifying, their forms writhing and shifting, as if they couldn't decide what shape to take. The boys backed away, their grandmother stepping in front of them once more. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice firm despite the fear they could see in her eyes. But even as she spoke, the original figure outside began to push harder against the barrier, its form growing more defined with each passing moment. The room was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, the air thick with the promise of something terrible. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the officer's voice rang out. "Stop!" Everyone turned, even the figures, their movements halting as they turned toward the man who had been cowering on the floor moments before. He was standing now, his face pale but determined, his hands clutching something small and metallic. It was a badge, not his own, but one that looked ancient, its surface engraved with symbols the boys didn't recognize. "You don't belong here," the officer said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "This is not your place." The figure outside let out another guttural laugh. "You think that trinket can stop us?" The officer didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, holding the badge out in front of him. The symbols began to glow, their light cutting through the darkness like a blade. The figures recoiled, their forms flickering as if the light were burning them. The boys watched in awe as the officer took another step forward, his confidence growing with each passing moment. Their grandmother turned to him, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Where did you get that?" "It doesn't matter," he said, his focus never wavering from the figures. "What matters is that it works." But even as the figures began to retreat, the original one outside let out a roar of defiance, its form surging forward with renewed strength. The officer faltered, the light from the badge dimming as the figure closed the distance. The boy's grandmother reacted instantly, stepping beside him and raising her hands once more. Together, their combined efforts pushed the figure back, its form writhing in pain. But the victory was short-lived. The ground beneath them began to shake again, and the humming returned, louder and more menacing than ever. The boys could feel it in their bones, the vibration threatening to tear them apart. And then, with a deafening crash, the entire house was plunged into darkness. The house was swallowed by an eerie silence as the darkness engulfed them. The boys clutched each other tightly, their breaths shallow and rapid, their eyes searching for any sign of their grandmother or the officer. The oppressive hum had stopped, but the weight of something unseen pressed heavily on their chests. "Grandma," the older boy called out, his voice trembling. "I'm here." Her voice came, steady but distant. "Stay where you are." The officer's voice followed, strained but determined. "We can't hold it off for long. Whatever this thing is, it's not done." The air around them shifted, a sudden rush of cold making their skin prickle. From the depths of the darkness, the faint glow of the officer's badge began to reappear, its symbols flickering weakly. The boys squinted, trying to make out the figures of their grandmother and the officer. Slowly, the light grew stronger, illuminating their faces and the swirling shadows that surrounded them. Their grandmother was on her knees, her hands pressed against the floor, muttering words the boys didn't understand. The officer stood beside her, the badge held high, its glow casting long, wavering shadows across the room. "We have to end this now," their grandmother said, her voice filled with urgency. "If we don't, it will take everything." The officer nodded, his grip on the badge tightening. "What do we do?" She glanced at the boys, her expression softening for just a moment. "We need their help," she said quietly. The boys exchanged a fearful glance, their instincts screaming at them to stay hidden. But something in their grandmother's eyes gave them courage. Slowly, they stepped forward, their movements hesitant but resolute. "What do we need to do?" the older boy asked, his voice small but steady. Their grandmother smiled faintly, her pride shining through despite the dire circumstances. "Just trust me," she said. She reached out and took their hands, her grip warm and reassuring despite the cold that surrounded them. The officer moved closer, holding the badge between them. The symbols flared brighter, the light pushing back the shadows as the hum began to build again, low and menacing. The figure outside let out a guttural roar, its form surging forward with renewed ferocity. The boys could feel the vibrations in their bones, the force of the creature's presence threatening to overwhelm them. "Focus," their grandmother said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Think of the light. Think of everything good and strong in this world." The boys closed their eyes, their hands gripping hers tightly. They thought of the warmth of the sun on their faces, the laughter they shared on lazy afternoons, the unshakable love of their family. Slowly, the fear that had gripped them began to loosen, replaced by a quiet, growing strength. The light from the badge flared brighter, its glow spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering and dissolving as the light touched them. The figure outside let out another roar, its voice filled with rage and desperation. It surged forward again, its form colliding with the barrier of light. For a moment, it seemed as though the light might falter, the weight of the creature's power pressing against it. But then, the younger boy opened his eyes, his gaze steady and unafraid. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice clear and strong. The figure hesitated, its movements slowing. The older boy joined his brother, his voice ringing out in the darkness. "You can't take what isn't yours." Their grandmother and the officer exchanged a quick glance, their expressions filled with both surprise and hope. The boys' voices seemed to strengthen the light, its glow becoming almost blinding. The figure let out one final, ear-splitting roar before its form began to dissolve, the shadows around it disintegrating into nothingness. The humming stopped, replaced by a profound, almost deafening silence. The light from the badge faded, its symbols dimming until they were barely visible. The officer lowered it slowly, his hands trembling. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Their grandmother stood, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the corners where the shadows had lingered. Finally, she nodded. For now. The boys sagged with relief, their exhaustion finally catching up to them. Their grandmother pulled them into a tight embrace, her arms wrapping around them protectively. "You were so brave," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. The officer sank to the floor, his back against the wall. He looked at the badge in his hand, its surface dull and lifeless now. "What was that thing?" he asked, his voice filled with both awe and fear. Their grandmother hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "It's something old," she said finally. "Something that feeds on fear and darkness. It's been watching our family for a long time, waiting for a moment of weakness." The officer frowned, his brow furrowing. "Why your family?" She shook her head. "That's a question I don't have an answer to. But what matters is that it's gone. And it won't be coming back anytime soon." The boys pulled away from their grandmother, their faces filled with a mix of relief and curiosity. "What about the badge?" the older boy asked, his gaze shifting to the object in the officer's hand. Their grandmother studied it for a moment, her expression unreadable. "That's a story for another time," she said. But as the officer held the badge up to the light, the boys noticed something strange. One of the symbols, faint and almost imperceptible, was still glowing. Their grandmother's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing as she reached for the badge. "It's not over," she said quietly, her voice filled with a new kind of urgency. The boys exchanged a quick, worried glance, their relief replaced by a sinking feeling. Whatever they had faced tonight, it was only the beginning. And somewhere in the darkness, far beyond the reach of the light, something stirred.